Most horror films try to terrify us with what they show: faces twisting in fear, shadows stretching across hallways, creatures crawling out of the dark. But every so often, a film unsettles us in a quieter, stranger way, through something we can't see at all. A tightening in the stomach, a sudden wave of unease, a shiver that seems to rise from nowhere. People walk away from these films convinced the story or imagery disturbed them, yet those who pay attention insist the real culprit was the sound. Hidden beneath orchestral cues and ambient noise, some productions slipped in audio experiments that had nothing to do with traditional scoring. Low-end vibrations that hover just below conscious hearing. Strange intervals designed to confuse the inner ear. Whispered textures buried deep in the mix, audible only to the most sensitive listeners. And behind the scenes, there were always rumors, tones that shouldn't be used commercially, mixes that made crew members physically ill, tracks that composers refused to revisit once the film wrapped. In this episode, we'll examine the movies where the soundtrack didn't simply reinforce the horror, it amplified it in ways the human body wasn't ready for. These are the films that sparked headaches, sleepless nights, and unexplained anxiety, long before audiences realized anything was wrong. Because sometimes, the scariest part of a horror film isn't what you watch. It's what you hear without even knowing it. Fact 1. The Witch Who Came from the Sea, 1976. While The Witch Who Came from the Sea is often discussed for its dreamlike imagery and fractured psychology, its most haunting effect comes from a soundtrack designed to destabilize emotional perception. Rather than using melodic cues, the composer crafted a soundscape built around tones that waver and bend just enough to unsettle the listener's internal balance. The score uses microtonal intervals pushed slightly between standard notes, producing uneasy, wobbling harmonics. These sounds are layered with gradual tape flutter, tiny fluctuations that create the sensation of something breathing within the music. Viewers frequently describe feeling adrift or emotionally off-center during scenes that should feel calm. The production also manipulated field recordings from beaches and industrial coastlines. Instead of using the natural sounds literally, the team filtered out familiar details, leaving only smooth, cavernous resonances. These textures drift beneath the soundtrack like distant memories, enhancing the film's themes of trauma and disorientation. Hidden even deeper are faint vocal bends, whisper-level performances recorded by actors reading fragmented monologues. These lines were stretched until they dissolved into soft, trembling currents of sound. Most viewers never consciously register them, but they contribute to the film's quietly collapsing atmosphere. The vinyl soundtrack release included none of these experimental components, showcasing only the melodic foundation. That omission underscores how much of the film's emotional force comes from its buried layers, a sonic architecture crafted to bypass reason and seep into the psyche. Fact 2. Phase 4, 1974. Although Phase 4 is framed as a science fiction thriller, its deepest chills emerge from its sound design, a portrayal of communication so alien that the viewer feels its presence before they can rationalize it. The film imagines the world as perceived through the ants' evolving intelligence, and much of that imagination comes alive through frequency rather than imagery. The audio team built the ants' voices using a blend of synthetic pulses, analog oscillators, and slowed-down recordings of insect movement. These sounds were layered to create vibrations that hover near the lower threshold of human hearing, producing physical sensations rather than clear auditory cues. Viewers often describe a tightening in the chest or a creeping sense of being observed, even when the scene appears visually quiet. Clicks, chirps, and metallic tones mimic communication that feels both organic and mechanical. Their irregular rhythms suggest intelligence without emotion patterns that seem to respond, shift, and evolve. As the ants grow more organized, the frequencies subtly change, becoming more intrusive, more resonant, more impossible to ignore. Even human-centered scenes are manipulated through abrupt shifts in room tone and unnatural pulses woven into the background. Director Saul Bass believed sound could communicate intelligence more effectively than visuals, and the film delivers on that vision. The viewer becomes attuned to vibrations rather than words, instinctively reacting to what they can't consciously hear. By the climax, the frequencies have become a form of psychological pressure, pushing the audience toward the same sense of helplessness felt by the characters. Phase 4 is not just a story about rising insect intelligence, it is an experiment in sound as alien contact and encounter felt in the body before it reaches the mind. Fact 3. Malatesta's Carnival of Blood, 1973. At first glance, Malatesta's Carnival of Blood resembles little more than a chaotic, low-budget fever dream. But its true power lies in the sound design, a collage of warped textures and unstable acoustics that seems to bend reality around the viewer. The carnival setting becomes a sonic trap, filled with noises that feel less recorded and more summoned. Much of the film's unsettling atmosphere comes from nighttime field recordings captured at derelict amusement parks. Metal structures groaned under shifting temperatures, wind slipped through hollow frameworks, and abandoned rides produced eerie resonances. These recordings were then slowed, reversed, and looped into patterns that defy musical rhythm. The effect is hypnotic and nauseating, as though the space itself is caught in an endless, broken cycle. The production also leaned heavily on malfunctioning audio hardware. Reel-to-reel machines with worn magnetic heads produced irregular playback speeds, bending tones into warped shapes. These imperfections became part of the film's core soundscape, generating a sense of vertigo that lingers beneath even mundane scenes. One engineer recalled that the machines felt haunted, producing tones no one remembered recording. To heighten the paranoia, the mix incorporates scattered whisper fragments, clipped syllables, stray breaths, and distorted mutters that pan abruptly across channels. Viewers during early screenings sometimes turned around in confusion, believing someone had spoken behind them. There is no official soundtrack release, and surviving prints differ noticeably in audio quality. This inconsistency only deepens the film's reputation as a piece of sonic hallucination, a horror experience shaped by the unpredictable chaos of failing machines and accidental frequencies. Fact 4 Images, 1972. Images blurs the boundary between sound and emotion, constructing an auditory world that mirrors the protagonist's unraveling psyche. Instead of guiding the viewer, the score intentionally destabilizes them, using music and noise not as storytelling tools, but as psychological intrusions. John Williams, far removed from the sweeping themes he would later become known for, creates a brittle, fragmented score built on atonal clusters and sudden bursts of sharp percussion. These sounds feel less like music and more like internal disruptions, the audible shape of a mind cracking under pressure. Percussionist Stomu Yamashita's metallic strikes punctuate the soundtrack like intrusive thoughts breaking through the calm. Equally unsettling is the way Images treats everyday sounds. A faucet dripping becomes impossibly loud. A distant knock seems to echo inside the viewer's skull. Even moments of quiet are haunted by faint breaths and shifting room tones, as though the environment itself is anxious. These distortions blur reality, making it unclear which sounds exist in the world and which are born from the protagonist's paranoia. Hidden beneath certain scenes are whisper fragments, broken syllables, and trembling breaths, processed until they resemble thoughts leaking into the open. Sound engineers later admitted that these sessions felt deeply personal, almost invasive, because the whispers seemed to come from inside the room rather than from the speakers. Images doesn't frighten through spectacle, it frightens through disorientation. Its soundscape acts like an extension of the character's fractured identity, making the audience feel the same instability she does. The horror comes not from monsters or threats, but from the terrifying uncertainty of what the mind can manufacture. Fact 5. The Sentinel, 1977. While The Sentinel is celebrated for its shocking imagery, its most invasive horrors occur in the realm of sound. The production embraced a suite of psychoacoustic techniques designed not merely to frighten, but to physically influence the viewer's body without their awareness. Central to this approach was the use of a subharmonic generator, a device capable of producing ultra-low bass frequencies that resonate more in the chest than the ear. These frequencies were layered subtly into scenes involving the building's mysterious tenants, creating an oppressive sensation that caused numerous theatergoers to report nausea or dizziness. Projectionists in major cities noted that even staff felt uneasy during repeated showings. The soundtrack also incorporates heavily altered animal vocalizations, slowed goat bleats, distorted pigeon calls, and pitch-shifted cat sounds stretched into shapeless, unsettling textures. When woven beneath dialogue, these sounds create the uncanny impression of something breathing behind the walls. Several sound engineers refused overtime sessions, claiming the mix produced an inexplicable agitation. Scattered throughout the film are irregular knocks and shuffles recorded in the apartment building used during production. These noises were left unbalanced between audio channels, triggering the subconscious feeling of movement just outside the frame. The result is a persistent, low-grade paranoia that deepens the film's supernatural themes. The official soundtrack release omits these more aggressive sonic layers, fueling rumors that the studio deliberately toned down the mix. Those who experience the theatrical version insist it remains one of the most physically unsettling audio treatments of the decade. Fact 6. The Haunting of Julia, 1977. Though The Haunting of Julia unfolds as a sorrow-soaked ghost story, the film's quiet devastation is driven as much by its sound design as its narrative. Rather than using traditional horror cues, the production leaned into microtonal dissonance clusters of notes deliberately positioned between standard pitches, designed to unsettle the inner ear. Composer Colin Towns crafted these tones using unconventional bowing techniques, scraping strings with irregular pressure to produce shimmering, unstable frequencies. These textures often sit beneath otherwise gentle scenes, creating emotional confusion. The audience senses dread even when the characters appear calm. Musicians later admitted that recording these passages was draining, describing a physical tightness they couldn't quite explain. Equally haunting are the processed child vocal elements embedded into the mix. These samples were stretched into long, wavering breaths and filtered until they resembled faint exhalations coming from somewhere just out of sight. Engineers recalled that long sessions with these recordings caused mild vertigo, especially when played at lower volumes. To heighten the film's oppressive realism, the team captured ambient room tones from various household surfaces, rattling vents, window vibrations, and the subtle hum of appliances. Instead of cleaning these imperfections, they blended them into the soundtrack, creating the sensation of a house that reacts emotionally to the characters. The commercial soundtrack release omits most of these experimental elements, leaving only the melodic lines. As a result, the film's original theatrical audio remains a unique artifact, a soundscape engineered to slip beneath the viewer's conscious guard and disturb them from the inside out. Fact 7. The Nightcomers, 1971. While The Nightcomers presents itself as a brooding, gothic drama, its sound design conceals a level of manipulation rarely acknowledged. The film's visual restraint is counterbalanced by an audio palette built to unsettle the body in ways the mind can't easily explain. Many of the ambient layers were recorded inside century-old stone buildings, whose architecture produced unpredictable resonances. Footsteps and distant voices bounced through narrow corridors, generating low-frequency rumbles that the engineers left untouched. These natural vibrations were subtly folded beneath dialogue, creating a sense of emptiness and emotional coldness, as though the house itself disapproved of its inhabitants. The team also recorded bowed metal rods, dragging the bow at irregular angles to produce unstable drones that wobble just out of tune. These drones are woven so quietly into the soundtrack that most viewers never consciously notice them, yet they create a persistent tension that lingers even in moments of calm. A particularly eerie layer came from children's vocal recordings performed in a drafty, unheated room. The cold caused the singers' voices to tremble, producing a brittle tonal quality. When slowed and stretched, these tremors transformed into spectral textures that hover beneath the score. Because The Nightcomers wasn't marketed as horror, these sonic experiments went largely unremarked, but sensitive listeners often recall a creeping unease, a sense that something in the soundtrack is subtly misaligned. In truth, the film's greatest terror lies not in its story, but in the quiet vibrations and shifting harmonics that whisper beneath every frame. Fact 8. Let's Scare Jessica to Death, 1971. Although Let's Scare Jessica to Death is celebrated for its dreamy ambiguity, the film reaches its most disturbing heights through a soundtrack built on fragmented whispers and fractured perception. Unlike most supernatural dramas, the audio doesn't simply accompany Jessica's paranoia, it actively participates in it. The sound designers recorded close mic vocals from multiple actors, encouraging them to produce breathy syllables, trembling vowels, and incomplete words. These fragments were layered into drifting clusters that appear suddenly, vanish, then return at altered pitches. The effect is unnerving. Audiences often describe feeling surrounded by voices that never fully form sentences, mirroring Jessica's dissolving sense of reality. Supplementing these whispers are environmental textures captured with failing analog recorders. The machines introduced warping fluctuations, sub-bass throbs, and irregular crackling that distort the natural ambience of fields and lakes. These imperfections weren't removed, they were embraced, giving the landscape a haunted, unstable quality. Some sound engineers later spoke about phantom noises that emerged unexpectedly during mixing sessions, artifacts created by the equipment's deteriorating magnetic heads. Rather than discarding them, the team used these sonic anomalies to deepen the film's sense of drifting madness. Because the soundtrack was never officially released, the full audio architecture survives only in the film itself. Viewers who isolate the whisper tracks often claim to detect extra breaths or ghostly murmurs that don't appear tied to any visible source. In its quietest moments, "Let's Scare Jessica to Death" dissolves the boundary between psychological horror and acoustic hallucination, a soundscape that erodes sanity as gently as it creeps in. Fact 9. The Legacy of Satan, 1974. Though remembered primarily as a low-budget slice of occult exploitation, The Legacy of Satan contains one of the strangest sound constructions of its era. What seems at first like clumsy audio work slowly reveals itself as something far more intentional, a sonic environment engineered through malfunction, randomness, and electrical instability. The sound team reportedly used synthesizers that were already in poor condition, devices prone to voltage fluctuations and unpredictable pitch drift. Rather than repairing them, the engineers embraced their faults, recording hours of warped oscillations, collapsing tones, and distorted hums. These broken signals were then blended beneath ritual chants, creating a sense of sonic nausea that doesn't align with conventional music theory. Equally disorienting were the tape loops built from truncated breaths and clipped speech. By splicing fragments together at irregular intervals, editors created muttering patterns that feel like incomplete thoughts echoing in the background. During early screenings, some viewers turned around in their seats, convinced someone behind them was whispering, unaware the sound was buried in the far left and right channels at nearly inaudible levels. The film never received a proper soundtrack release, and many of the original elements no longer exist. Collectors comparing surviving prints note substantial differences in audio texture, with the earliest versions containing a far heavier, low-end rumble. These inconsistencies suggest that The Legacy of Satan was assembled from sonic debris, a horror film whose unease grows not from story or imagery, but from the corrupted frequencies of failing machines. Fact 10. Don't Look Now, 1973. Don't Look Now is often remembered for its dreamlike editing and shocking final reveal, but beneath its imagery lies a soundscape built to quietly disturb the viewer long before anything supernatural occurs. The film whispers rather than screams, unsettling the audience through a mesh of fractured acoustics and environmental cues that feel almost too intimate. Most of the tension comes from the way seemingly ordinary sounds are recorded and layered. Footsteps echo unevenly on wet cobblestone. Water ripples with an unnatural sharpness beneath the surface of the canals. The faint rustle of fabric during simple gestures becomes strangely amplified, as if the world itself is leaning closer to listen. These tiny textures create the sense that Venice is alive, observing the characters from every corner. Composer Pino Donaggio reinforces this unease through delicate piano phrases that drift into dissonance. Several notes slip slightly off pitch, and when combined with the film's unstable tape delay, the score feels like a memory struggling to stay intact. Even quiet scenes pulse with hidden tension. What makes Don't Look Now particularly haunting is the way silence is manipulated. Instead of offering relief, moments of stillness reveal distant noises, a boat creaking, a muffled shout in the fog, a single footstep with no visible source. These sounds sit just at the edge of awareness, creating the uncanny feeling that something is watching, waiting. It's a film where the soundtrack doesn't simply accompany the mystery, it deepens it, turning every sound into a quiet omen the audience senses before they understand. Fact 11. The Strange Vengeance of Rosalie, 1972. Though The Strange Vengeance of Rosalie isn't categorized as a horror movie, its reputation for unsettling audiences has grown steadily over the years, largely due to a sound design that disrupts the viewer's sense of stability. The film's restrained visual style hides an audio strategy far more aggressive than its surface implies. The production built its atmosphere around sparse, almost imperceptible audio cues. Engineers recorded environmental hums inside abandoned rural structures, intentionally preserving distortions, electrical buzzing, and wind interference. These textures were layered beneath dialogue in ways that made scenes feel subtly contaminated, as though the landscape itself carried an unseen threat. Even more disorienting were the rhythmic pulses derived from an outdated medical training device. These beats were warped and filtered until they became a biologically confusing throb, not quite a heartbeat, but close enough to trigger instinctive discomfort. In theaters with strong bass systems, audiences reported tightness in their sternum and unexplained anxiety. The director encouraged these choices, insisting the sound should whisper what the film refuses to show. This philosophy culminated in sequences where nothing overtly frightening occurs, yet the atmosphere feels suffocating. Some early viewers left screenings unnerved, convinced they'd watched a horror film, even though the plot never veers into the supernatural. No official soundtrack was ever issued, likely because the audio stems were scattered across partially damaged reels. Today, fans studying the film's soundscape often describe hearing faint textures they can't fully isolate, remnants of a sonic experiment crafted to unsettle the body more than the mind. Fact 12. The Witching, 1972. On the surface, The Witching seems like another low-budget occult thriller from the early 70s, but its audio history reveals a far stranger story. Much of the film's unease is rooted not in what viewers can hear clearly, but in the buried sonic textures that were deliberately engineered to sit beneath conscious awareness. During post-production, the audio team experimented with metal percussion and detuned chimes, bending tones until they hovered in unsettling micro-ranges. Beneath these shimmering layers, engineers introduced a pulsing, low-frequency wave generated by an old analog oscillator. This frequency sat dangerously close to infrasound territory, causing mild vertigo and chest tightness in people especially sensitive to low-end vibration. One mixer recalled that even the furniture in the studio vibrated subtly whenever the tone was active. Perhaps most intriguing was the use of fragmented ritual speech, recorded by an uncredited performer who whispered improvised chants into a close microphone. These recordings were reversed, stretched, and filtered until they became almost unrecognizable, a faint, trembling presence that seemed to occupy the soundscape rather than accompany it. Early viewers described feeling watched during otherwise quiet scenes, unaware that these voices were hidden deep in the mix. The original audio elements have since vanished, reportedly misplaced during a studio overhaul. As a result, no official soundtrack release contains the film's strangest components. What survives is only the faint echo of a sound design built to bypass comprehension and press directly against the nervous system. Fact 13. The Legacy, 1978. The Legacy is often praised for its glossy occult aesthetic, yet the true source of its lingering unease lies in its audio, specifically, the subtle vocal textures hidden deep within the mix. Instead of using typical choral effects, composer Michael J. Lewis experimented with recorded whispers and fragmented speech, transforming them into sonic shadows that cling to the edges of each scene. The process was unusual. Multiple actors were asked to whisper nonsensical lines in a darkened studio. Their voices were slowed, reversed, and filtered through tape machines until they became haunting, unsteady tones that barely resembled speech. Engineers involved in these sessions later described an uncanny sensation, as though the whispers were responding to them rather than simply playing back. Adding to the tension, the film employs high-frequency sweeps that drift unpredictably from left to right. These subtle shifts created a phantom-like presence in early screenings. Viewers later recalled feeling as if someone was leaning close to murmur in their ear. In at least one theater, staff reportedly reduced playback volume after multiple complaints of dizziness. When the soundtrack album was released, these experimental layers were conspicuously absent. Only the orchestral components remained, leaving fans to speculate why the original audio was toned down. Lewis himself admitted discomfort with revisiting the recordings, noting they carried an emotional weight he hadn't anticipated. Visually, The Legacy presents a polished, supernatural thriller. Sonically, it hides an acoustic illusion, one designed to bypass logic and slip straight into the audience's subconscious. Fact 14. Burnt Offerings, 1976. Although Burnt Offerings is often remembered as a moody haunted house tale, its most insidious effect comes not from the story, but from the sound beneath it. Viewers who saw the film in theaters during its initial run commonly reported a strange heaviness, a quiet tension that grew long before anything supernatural appeared. That atmosphere wasn't accidental, it was engineered. Behind the scenes, the sound department crafted a bed of low-frequency vibrations, generated through analog oscillators and then tucked beneath the orchestral score. These tones hovered just below conscious hearing, affecting the audience physically rather than emotionally. Projectionists later mentioned headaches after repeated screenings, while some viewers described a sense of pressure in their chest during otherwise uneventful scenes. Layered atop these vibrations were unusual textures, bowed cymbals recorded at awkward angles, reversed piano tones, and eerie breaths captured from various cast members. These elements were degraded intentionally to produce a faintly decomposing quality. One sound mixer confessed he avoided certain late-night sessions because the mix produced an inexplicable sense of dread. When the film was eventually released on home media, much of this sublayer vanished in the remixes, making the experience noticeably less oppressive. Those who saw Burnt Offerings in 1976 insist that the original sound design felt alive unchanced by the house's influence. Its most haunting element wasn't a ghostly figure, but the unseen frequencies that crawled beneath the score, whispering a threat the ear could barely detect. Fact 15. The Shout, 1978. Among the many psychological horrors of the 1970 seconds, few films weaponize sound the way The Shout does. Its story revolves around an outsider who claims to possess a lethal scream, a mythic sound capable of shattering a person's mind. But what's more disturbing is how the production blurred the line between fiction and reality by building a soundtrack that feels physically invasive. Rather than relying on recognizable musical motifs, the sound team created a collage of abrasive textures, layered screams, metallic friction, and distorted breaths that twist into unsteady drones. Several mixers later admitted those sessions were uncomfortable, describing a strange tightening in their temples whenever the full combination played. One editor even recalled feeling the air compress in the room, though the monitors weren't loud. Composer Tony Banks approached the score with experimental instincts, reversing vocal elements, stretching inhalations until they became ghostly streaks, and weaving in low-end pulses just above the infrasound threshold. Banks later revealed that portions of the audio genuinely unsettled him, leading him to avoid recreating certain cues when asked about a future soundtrack release. Curiously, none of these raw sonic experiments appear in the official soundtrack albums. They seem to exist only in the original theatrical prints, adding to the film's peculiar legacy, a horror experience in which the visuals remain restrained, but the audio gnaws at the viewer's nerves. For audiences sensitive to low frequencies, The Shout doesn't merely unsettle, it invades, leaving a lingering sensation long after the screen fades to black. Bonus film The Shiver of the Vampires, 1971. Though The Shiver of the Vampires is often praised for its psychedelic visuals and sensual gothic aesthetic, the film's most aggressive experimentation took place in the recording studio. Beneath its flamboyant style lies a soundtrack shaped by electronic improvisation, unstable equipment, and chance-born distortions, a mixture so unrepeatable that no two surviving prints sound exactly alike. The band Acanthus built the score through late-night jam sessions using prototype synthesizers and amplifiers on the verge of collapse. These machines drifted unpredictably in pitch, sputtered with voltage spikes, and produced shimmering tones that seemed to bend under their own instability. Musicians recalled that the equipment behaved differently every time they switched it on, making large sections of the soundtrack impossible to recreate afterward. Layered into this chaotic mix were reversed guitar passages fed through faltering tape loops. The tape's worn magnetic surface introduced warps and dropouts, creating eerie glides and ghost-like streaks of sound. Engineers also captured the low electrical hum generated by the building itself, a rumble that, once filtered and amplified, became a pulsing undertone that many viewers later described as physically irritating. The film's most unsettling element, however, may be its whispered motifs. Fragments of laughter, clipped breaths, and half-spoken phrases stretch through delay units until they smear into drifting, inhuman textures. These voices hover at the boundary of comprehension, appearing and disappearing like apparitions. No complete archival set of audio stems exists today. Each restoration sounds slightly different, hinting that the film's signature unease was born from analog unpredictability rather than calculated design. The soundtrack was not merely recorded, it mutated, leaving behind a sonic fingerprint that can never be fully replicated. If these hidden frequencies and buried sonic experiments left you feeling a little unsettled, remember that reaction is exactly what these filmmakers were chasing. And there are countless more stories like this tucked away in the shadows of cinema history, waiting for someone brave enough to dig them up. So, if you want to keep exploring the strange, the uncanny, and the beautifully obscure corners of horror, don't forget to subscribe to The Night Shriek. Leave a like, share this with someone who loves the darker side of film, and I'll see you in the next descent into the unknown.